The Return of the Twelves by Pauline Clarke, Chapter 13, The Battle of Atticum. In the next few days, Max and Jane spent more time with the Twelves than with the rest of the family. For one thing, the fine hot weather had, for the moment, broken, and Mrs. Morley, still busy with all the details of settling into the new house, hardly noticed how much they were in the attic. For another, Jane had become as enslaved to the young men as Max, but in a rather different way. It was Jane who first said that they should pick up and speak to each young man, that they should get to know them separately. For a third, all the fuss about the American professor seemed to have died down. Their father had said no more, and Philip had been particularly nice to Max, as if he were trying to atone for the fight in the attic. It was Jane who noticed that Cracky, aged 5, had indeed, in his wooden state, a crack in the back of his head beneath his hat. "And how did you get that, Cracky?" Jane whispered. "Hit by a cannonball and never reeled up," replied Cracky promptly and proudly. And it was Jane who saw that Tracky, aged 10, his friend, was forever following people about and tracking them down. When he managed to take them by surprise, he would fling his arms round them and shout, "Got you!" very much as Max sometimes did. She also noticed that Tracky was a particular gadfly to the sober King Perry. The two were evidently enemies of long standing, and she wondered what old quarrel lay behind it. Jane observed, too, how like a tiny ape's was the bright-eyed, stubby face of Monkey, and he behaved like a monkey as well, climbing up everything he could find, in the way which he must have learned when he was a midshipman on the Invincible. "And you know, Jane," Max said, "they're all beastly to poor old Gravy. I know he's gloomy and never smiles, but whenever he opens his mouth, they sneer at him." "Yes, and he often falls over, because he's either nervous or he's absent-minded or something, and then they all laugh," she added, for she had seen this too. "I don't wonder he's sour, like Bramwell says in the story. Do you? Perhaps, if you were to spoil him a bit, he'd feel better," Max suggested. As for the volatile Sneaky, he was often to be seen playing tricks upon the rest, sneaking up on them, tripping over them, blowing down their necks, and then looking the other way, and generally behaving in the most unkingly fashion. Then he would as suddenly go into a mood and look haughty and dark, and hide in some corner by himself, and sneer at anyone who came to talk to him, and make bitter remarks about his fate. He was certainly, as Jane said, a strange mixture. The other two kings, Perry and Ross, were more straightforward and dignified, but very ingenious. Perry was tall and spare, Ross was shorter and broader, and seemed the most open in the way he behaved. It was often they who led the rest on clambering expeditions in the attic. Over mountains of books, up to the plateau of trunks and furniture, they went looking down from these dizzy heights to piles of folded curtains below, crossing a glacier, which was a mirror not yet in use. And from there, jumping into a soft snowdrift of spare blankets. When they did these things, Max and Jane had to watch them carefully, in case one should get left behind and lost. Now one morning the telegraph boy came whistling up to the Morleys' door and knocked loudly. Philip, who had been lurking around the house the last day or two, almost as if he were expecting something of the kind, darted out of the drawing-room, opened the door, and took in the cablegram. This he at once began to open, while telling the boy there would be no answer at the moment. "How do you know it's for you?" Jane asked, on her way to do an errand for her mother. "Because it says so," growled Philip, disappearing again. But now that he had done it, now that this letter had reached the professor and the professor had answered, Philip felt worried and uneasy. How was he to tell Max? How was he to persuade Max this was all for his good? What would his mother and father say? And what would all those cross people who wrote to the paper say if the soldiers left England? Philip read the message again. "Flying to England, 15th, to inspect wooden soldiers. Brewer." Philip chewed the back of his knuckles, and then flicked his fingers, standing first on one foot, and then on the other. And would Seneca D. Brewer expect to be entertained by Mrs. Morley? And what would Mrs. Morley think of this? Philip often referred to his mother as Mrs. Morley, It was a kind of joke used when he needed anything very badly, or had something to confess. He now wandered out to the kitchen, looking vacant on purpose, and said, "Mrs. Morley?" "Hello, darling, what do you want?" she said at once. Philip handed her the form. "What's this?" she said, taking it with a floury hand. "Philip, do you mean you wrote to him?" she said. Philip nodded, still looking vacant, his eyes fixed on a far corner of the ceiling. "But what did you tell him?" "Just how Max had found them, and that they'd go with the ones in the history of the young men." "But does Max know? Does he agree? You heard what he said to Daddy." "He doesn't know." "Well, Philip, whatever made you do it when you heard what Max said?" she asked. "I'd already done it." His mother was silent, for she could not help admiring his prompt efficiency. She supposed he had compared the soldiers with the description in the book. On the other hand, it was no joke to bring a professor flying over the Atlantic only to find a small boy would not part with some wooden soldiers. She said so. "I know," Philip said gloomily, "but surely he'll see reason. After all, £5,000. "Phil, you know what kind of boy Max is. Money means nothing to him yet. Why should it? Also, how could anyone possibly tell?" she said crossly. "There's no proof they're the ones. Such things were made in thousands. How can we take all that money from a crazy scholar who's let an idea run away with him?" "That's his lookout. But you know what Max calls them, don't you? You remember the first day? He called them the 12s, and you said, 'What is the 12s?' I remember distinctly. And have you forgotten? One's Butter, aged 140, and one's Stumps. It's all in the book, you know. How did Max know?" "Well, he said Jane. Well, he and Jane have been reading the book." "Mrs. Morley," Philip said with some exasperation, "it was all before you produced the book. You wouldn't do for a detective. Max knows something more than he's saying." "What do you mean? What do you mean, Philip? How could he?" "He brought the old roll of rag with him inside, straight down, quite openly, to show us all." "All the same, I swear he's got some clue those soldiers belong to the Brontes. Well, what shall I do?" he said, appealingly, as if he were Max's age again. "You must go up and tell him what you've done. You've got yourself into it, Phil. You must simply go and tell him and see what he thinks. He may be willing to part with them. You ought to prevent this poor man coming if he's not. You're not to bully and upset Max now." Phil went slowly upstairs, working out a plan of campaign as carefully as a general works out a battle. Meanwhile, Max was alone in the attic, absorbed in another battle. He had just put out the chessmen in a cohort as if they were a rival army, for he had just read Branwell's story, how he had let the 12s fight some cannibal ninepins. Sure enough, the young men had at once taken them for an army, and had prepared for battle. The Duke of Wellington, Bravey, Ross, and Perry had dragged Max's bag of marbles over the attic floor, and every man was seizing on these glittering cannonballs and bowling them for a noise like small thunder across the attic floor at the chessmen. Whenever a man was hit, there was a howl of glee, and if he were hit 3 times, he was pushed ignominiously from the field. Tracky was acting as ball boy, returning the cannonballs which missed. Monkey was beating the Ashanti drum with the balls of wood, and the Duke was standing on a pedestal made of 2 drafts, the flag planted beside him, urging his men on. The best shots were undoubtedly Stumps, Cheeky, Perry, and Ross. Sneaky was too excited to aim straight, but Gravy was extremely good, as he kept his eye on the job and never wavered or took time off to ask the rest to admire him. Meanwhile, Butter had wanted to be picked up, and he now surveyed the Battle of Atticum, as Max called it. From Max's hand, his 2 arms held aloft, like Moses in the Bible, as if he were holding up the good cause of the 12s. Max heard Philip's tread, thought the attic door was bolted, remembered Jane had gone out, and sprang to his feet too late. The attic door was opened, even as Max hissed, "Monster!" Butter crashed. He was still waving his arms wildly as Philip came in, and in a quick, instinctive movement to hide him, Max plunged him into his pocket, keeping his fingers on him. The battle had frozen. Some soldiers feigned dead. One solitary marble went rumbling away past Monkey at the drum into the far corner of the attic. "Hello," Philip said pleasantly. "Hello," Max said cautiously, and he sat down on the Ashanti stool, his hand gently round Butter crashing in his pocket. "Maxie," began Philip, and as he spoke, he picked up, who was it? It was Max's darling Stumps, as Jane called him. He held him with great care and consideration, however, looking at him off and on. "You know that professor," he went on, "who wrote to the paper about the soldiers?" "Yes," Max said. His heart gave a great uncontrolled whomp, like the noise of a drum. "Well, you don't think it would hurt, do you, for him to come and see these soldiers? Just look at them and see if he thinks they're the ones he wants," Philip wheedled. "I don't care whether he wants them or not," Max replied, going straight to the point. "He's not going to have them, so what's the use of him coming to see them?" "But if they are the right ones," Philip went on, "he'll give you £5,000 for them. Think how useful it would be. Smashing, Max. You'll be able to get all sorts of things you want, and after all, if he takes them to America, they'll be terribly well looked after. They'll have more marvelous museums and collections and things in America. They can't come to any harm." "They're not going to America," Max said, "because I'm not selling them." "Well, it's not really selling. It's kind of a reward for finding them. You know you won't want to play with them in a few more years, I promise you." "I don't play with them now," said Max with dignity. Philip smiled. "And anyway," he said, "if it once gets known you've got them, they'll want them at Haworth, at the Bronte Museum. You won't be allowed to keep them here. I bet Mummy and Daddy won't let you. Haworth is where they used to be. And if they are really Branwell's, the Jeannie Branny," he added. "Good, isn't it, the story?" "Mummy said," Max replied stubbornly, "that nobody could possibly prove they are the ones, so therefore the museum can't take them." Philip was silent a moment. "But you think they are, don't you?" he said next, trying it on. Max held on to Butter rather tightly and said nothing. His eyes were on Stumps, who was being waved through the air rather a lot, enough to cause him to swoon or be sick, Max thought. He hoped Stumps was safely frozen. "You do, don't you, Maxie?" Still Max said nothing. "I wonder why," Philip said, trying to draw him out. "Anyway," he said briskly, feeling slightly ashamed because he was up to something he did not understand. "This professor's coming, just to see them. It can't hurt." "But how does he know I've got them?" Max said, unable to believe what was obvious. "Because I've told him," leered Philip, teasing. He leered because he was now ashamed, properly, feeling Max's seriousness and distress. "But I told Daddy not to. I said I didn't want him to write," Max said, in the utmost consternation. "I wrote before you ever said that," Philip said. "You're a beast!" Philip did not look at him, for he was afraid his eyes were full of tears. "But I thought you'd be pleased to get the money when you'd thought it over," Philip said. "So I just did it. Look, this is what he says." Max read the cable. "I'm sorry you're cross," Philip said, putting on a slightly hurt voice. "I thought you'd be pleased." "But you don't understand," Max said, helplessly stroking Butter with one finger. He held out the other hand and took Stumps from his brother. Then he turned away and went over to the attic window, which was open, and put Stumps on the sill and looked out over the moors. "Oh, well," Philip said, and shrugged his shoulders. "You can always say no if you're silly." And he went out, relieved that it was over. And that's the end of chapter 13.